All right, we are back for our last speaker before our keynote. And this next speaker is David Mills. David Mills is a graduate of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University Belfast with an MA in Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. David previously served as a global scholar for Rotary International and is a 2020 ambassador for the Institute for Economics and Peace. His previous research focuses on identity and the impact of anti-immigration rhetoric on the lives and well-being of the Latinx community legally living in the United States. Here is David Mills with the very creative line for his presentation. Oops, it looks like I'm getting booted here. Oh, no worries, David. For Fox's sake, the violent impact of anti-immigration narratives in right-wing US media. I love that title, David.
Thank you. Well, thank you for allowing me on here, and thank you to everybody who's here. So dive in. Whoops. The desert along the border of Arizona and Mexico is a desolate place. With a climate that can produce as little as 3 inches of rain in a year, the temperatures reaching as high as 125 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 52 degrees Celsius. The Sonoran Desert is devoid of all but the hardest of life. The plants that do manage to grow in this cruelest of climates are sparsely foliated and won't provide a shady respite from the overwhelming midday sun. Instead, they will stab you with needles and thorns if you get too close. If that wasn't treacherous enough, this barren land also has a number of venomous creatures lurking in its various nooks and crannies that are perfectly willing to give you pain or death. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, giant centipedes, killer bees are just a few. There are even bobcats perched on giant cacti waiting to ambush you. No, seriously, there are bobcats on cacti. And all of that does not mention the most dangerous of all creatures in the Sonoran wilderness, humans. The land that borders the United States and Mexico is a death trap few would consider traversing. Yet each year, thousands of migrants attempt to cross the 100,000 square mile desert to come to the United States. In 2017, over 415,000 people were caught allegedly crossing the border from Mexico into the United States illegally. In 2018, that number rose to 520,000. Therefore, it's clear that the risk of detention or death does not deter migrants from their single-minded goal of coming to America. On the surface, these statistics appear overwhelming, and current data is often used as one of the measurements to justify propaganda and policy towards immigration. For example, media panelists and political lobbyists quote current statistics as they claim the US is being invaded. Politicians use them to create policies aimed at preventing Southern migrants from crossing the border. President Trump rants on Twitter that there isn't strong enough border security. And 24-hour news stations play video of migrant caravans on loop. These statistics and images used together convincingly set the stage as though the United States is at war. However, a broader view of the statistics tells a far different story. Even with the uptick to around 520,000 migrants in 2018, the numbers of people attempting to enter the US across the southern border are 1/3 what they were nearly 20 years ago. 500,000 people attempting to cross the border appears to be a lot of people. But when the scope is broadened to reveal 1.6 million people were detained at the southern border in 2000, the narrative of that statistic begins to change. My point is, statistics, while helpful, are only as truthful as their presentation. This is because statistics are not facts, they're interpretations, and interpretations are anything but objective. The reality that there are fewer people caught attempting to cross the border now than 20 years ago can be manipulated to have several different reasons depending on who's interpreting the data and how that data is being interpreted. As Brooke Gladstone points out, part of the problem stems from the fact that facts, even a lot of facts, don't constitute reality. Reality is what forms after we filter, arrange, and prioritize those facts and marinate them in our values and traditions. Reality is personal. This is an example of what is known as post-truth, or the idea that facts become secondary to emotion or personal belief. In a post-truth society, a repeated lie that appeals to belief enhances that belief and eventually becomes understood as truth. The lie becomes the new reality. Authority figures like political elites or media organizations use post-truth rhetoric to communicate principles that fit their narrative without losing credibility by being considered dishonest. In this presentation, I'll discuss theories of rhetorical devices to show how anti-immigration narratives, including asylum seekers and refugees in the United States, how narratives of right-wing media increase violence aimed at immigrants, including asylum seekers and refugees in the United States. I'll accomplish this by showing how ways in which a person receives information can influence the way they understand and act toward events and people associated with that information. I'll primarily refer to framing theory when discussing rhetorical devices, but post-truth rhetoric will be an underlying theme throughout this presentation. In a sense, political rhetoric is the repetitive use of particular language patterns designed by political elites and media outlets when sharing stories and describing events for the purpose of influencing their audience toward a specific goal. An example of this is the repetitive use of the term invasion by media outlets to describe immigrants at the US southern border as unwanted and dangerous. By using rhetoric, those with authority gain the ability to influence popular perception by manipulating facts or by replacing them altogether. Frames are used to help a person understand the social environment in which they live. They accomplish this by allowing a person to organize significant information about their social world based on personal experiences, which influences both perception and behavior. In essence, framing theory explains how people can experience the same event and come away with a different understanding of that event. Often, how an event is framed is dependent on the preferences of the audience. For example, a media network might choose different frameworks to portray immigration as positive or negative depending on the audience they're appealing to. This is important because by using framing theory, media outlets and other influencers can highlight specific facts in a way that allows them to control the narrative. How a person receives information can influence the way they understand and act toward events and people associated with that information. For example, negative framing of immigration at the southern border encourages increased fear and anxiety toward Latinx immigrants, which leads to the threat of violence or actual violence against that group, as well as those visually, verbally, or culturally associated with that group. Episodic versus thematic framing are competing narratives. Episodically framed narratives use human interest stories that focus on specific people or families in order to elicit emotion from the audience. Thematic frames, on the other hand, appeal to logic by using more generalized stories that focus on things like statistics. An example of episodic framing anti-immigration narratives that right-wing media uses to influence their audience is by interviewing family members of someone who was killed by an undocumented immigrant. And you can see that in this Fox News picture here. By contrast, a thematic frame is a way of presenting an issue in a broader context, using generalities and abstractions instead of more concrete real-life examples. It appeals to logic by using more generalized stories to focus on things like statistics. On this slide, you can see an example of thematic framing where Breitbart News is using vague statistics about crime rates to persuade their audience that sanctuary cities, and even more broadly, undocumented immigrants as a whole, are dangerous to US citizens. Issue framing is where the speaker focuses on specific issues in order to influence the audience to place greater weight on those issues when forming their opinions. By highlighting specific rhetoric or downplaying others, media outlets influence their audience to consider their preferred issues more heavily when formulating opinions. For example, when discussing immigration at the southern border, right-wing media outlets often emphasize the presence of criminals, like drug dealers, who sneak across the border. This imagery can cause Latinx immigrants, including asylum seekers, to become conflated with illegal, dangerous, and unwanted. Another example is illustrated in the Fox News poll, where the majority of respondents said that they believe the border between the US and Mexico should be closed, and that immigrants in the US help the country. At first, these seem to be contradictory responses. However, if you look at the questions in the poll that prompted these responses, it becomes more clear. If you look at the first question, you'll see that the idea of closing the border is the first thing that's mentioned. So it's put front and foremost. They also use rhetorical language that they've used throughout their media narratives about immigration, like the flow of migrants and illegal drugs. This negative language. And in the second part of the question, they talk about the reason not to close the borders is the economy will be hurt. Well, during the time of this poll, the economy was booming, so that wasn't as much of a concern for people. In the second question, that negative language like illegal and drugs and all of those other things are not present. So all you see is the term immigrants, which for many people will bring up images in their mind about maybe a relative or their great grandparents who came over from Ireland or Germany or somewhere else, or maybe even somebody who came here legally who has benefited the economy in some way. So it doesn't have the same negative connotations. Equivalency framing uses different but logically equivalent words and phrases to describe experiences. This can be used by media to convey an experience in a positive or negative way, depending on the audience. An example of this use of language when describing a person who has just crossed the border into the United States without going through the proper channels is illegal alien versus undocumented immigrant. These terms are logically equivalent, but lead to different associations. In these next few slides, you'll see some more examples of framing in right-wing US media. So if you look at right in the middle, you'll see Arizona border ranchers. That's an example of episodic framing where they're interviewing the ranchers. Also down in the left corner, you'll see like legal immigrant professor. It's another episodic framing. Right below it, you have Dems want illegal immigration to replace white conservatives. This is an example of issue framing. In this next slide with Fox News, you'll see another example of issue framing in the top right with caravan of diseases. And right below that, 300,000 illegals are part of the MS-13 gang. It's an example of thematic framing. And equivalency framing is used throughout all of these narratives. And this next one here is actually really an interesting one because this conversation was actually about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And so Tommy Lauren used immigration as an issue that was emphasized in order to say that there needs to be the Second Amendment, that they need to protect gun rights and that they need to have guns. Her comments actually were criticized quite heavily because her response came about a month after the El Paso shooting. She later did apologize, but as you can see in this apology, she continued that line of rhetoric even within the apology. Here's some examples of narratives during the age of Corona. If you look at the one with the picture in it, one thing that is clear in the language used in this article is that it appeals to the audience's sense of empathy to influence them towards its agenda. Without understanding the concepts of framing, articles like this can be very convincing. It can even lead the reader to believe that allowing immigrants, including asylum seekers, to enter the country during the pandemic is more harmful to the immigrant than sending them home. At this point, you might be asking, what does framing have to do with violence toward immigrants in the US? In short, if you convince people that certain minority groups are dangerous and unwanted, those people will be more willing to accept policies and actions that negatively impact that minority group. It can also result in an increase in negative attitudes and behaviors from individuals toward that minority group. In this way, narrative plays an important role in the level of violence aimed at the immigrant community, including asylum seekers and refugees. Violence is anything avoidable that prevents an individual or group from reaching their potential. I'll be focusing on structural and personal violence to show how negative narratives toward immigrants and right-wing media influences violent outcomes. So structural violence or social injustice has no specified actor or person committing the violence. In other words, dominant social groups control positions of authority. This grants them the power and influence to distribute access to resources, which negatively impacts persons within a minority social group's life chances. This can show up in the structure of society as unequal distributions in social resources. For the Latinx community, these structural inequalities show up in society in places like access to jobs, income, healthcare, housing, healthy food, and education. And there's another example in this picture with Hispanic women working slightly fewer hours, but earning substantially less per hour. It's also present within government policies towards immigration. For example, ICE raids. This image is of the Mississippi ICE raid where 700 people were arrested, the majority of whom were later released. And here you can see the media response attempting to justify their reasons for the ICE raids. Policy of family separation. And again, you can see the narrative of policy separation. The border detention. And here you can see in issue framing or episodic framing where Hispanic pastor, the interview of a Hispanic pastor. The border wall. Here you see some more narratives. And public charge policy. This policy dictates that legal immigrants, such as green card holders who receive financial support or public benefits from the government, may be denied citizenship. Structural violence has even influenced personal violence, such as at the border patrol using tear gas at the border. Even though this is an attack on specific people, this still results from structural violence because there is no specified actor committing the violence. While the Border Patrol committed the act, they can claim that they were following procedure. Personal violence or direct violence has an identified object and action. This means that there is an actor who carries out identifiable violence against a person, group, or nation. Direct violence can be the result of structural violence that shows up as excessive force from law enforcement, like the tear gas at the border, a minority group's response to social inequality, or it can lead to the othering of marginalized communities that lead to verbal abuse, social discrimination, and hate crimes. From 2015, 1 year prior to Trump being elected president, to 2018, the most recent year with statistics, hate crimes reported by Latinx individuals rose by 186 incidents per year. While Black communities remain the most affected by hate crimes, the Latinx community saw the largest jump in percentage of incidents based on ethnicity or race. Perhaps one of the most extreme examples of direct violence is the El Paso shooting that took place on August 3rd, 2019. In this case, a white nationalist drove 600 miles across Texas from Dallas to El Paso, specifically because he'd seen in the media that there were a lot of Latinx people living there. The rhetoric he used in his manifesto almost directly quotes many of the frames and narratives the president and right-wing media have repeatedly emphasized. His attack killed 23 people and injured 23 others. As part of my research, shortly after the El Paso shooting, I interviewed 4 Latinx Americans living in the Rio Grande Valley region of Texas. The Rio Grande is a region that borders Mexico. It's only a few hours from El Paso, and it has a similar demographic to El Paso. Each respondent pointed out how easily it could have been their community attacked instead of El Paso. They all echoed similar fears about leaving their homes and even described themselves as targets. One person said that she was so afraid to go shopping that when she did go to Walmart, she made sure not to check out near the entrances. Another noted that his wife was pregnant, and he openly wondered if it was a mistake to raise a Latino child in this current climate of hate towards Latinx people. One similarity that hate crimes like the El Paso shooting and governmental policy like the ICE raids in Mississippi have on Latinx communities is that it makes them fearful to leave their home, whether that be to go to work, take their kids to school, to go grocery shopping, or any other outing that leaves them vulnerable to violence. In this way, the impact of anti-immigration rhetoric has on policy and behavior has dramatic and harmful effects on the lives of those immigrant communities, and as a result of conflated identity, the greater Latinx community. Anti-immigration rhetoric in right-wing US media creates a narrative where violence against immigrants is an acceptable, if not unavoidable, consequence of protecting America from the perceived threat against its borders, culture, and resources. For those huddled masses who arrive at our imposing border yearning to breathe free, for those countless, desperate, and tired who seek refuge by crossing the desolate Sonoran Desert, risking death and aerial bobcats, the risk does not end with their arrival. It's only the beginning. Can you tell which frame I'm using to create this narrative? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. That was so interesting, especially being an American myself and seeing how these issues impact just even close to home where I'm from in Seattle, so far from that southern border. I think we'll have Morgan take you out of the screen sharing mode. We got, perfect, thank you. We have a few questions for you. The first question is, what kind of framing do you think would be best in countering anti-immigration policies?
That's a good question. I think that it's you. I mean, both sides use all of these framing techniques. And you can see it in left-wing and right-wing media, and the politicians use them as well.
Mm-hmm.
As far as which is the best, I think it really depends on what you're trying to convey. So, for example, if you're trying to appeal to somebody's sense of empathy, then you're going to maybe interview somebody who is like, say, a dreamer, for example, or somebody who came across the border at the risk of from the risk of death as an asylum seeker, or something that's going to appeal to that sense of empathy. If you're talking about policy and things like that, a lot of times using broader things like statistics is useful, because it can show, say people are talking about somebody who was killed by an immigrant, then showing statistics of the low numbers of people who actually commit crimes, of people who immigrate here, those numbers are quite low, comparatively speaking. Actually, those numbers increase as the generations, with the generations after those first people come over. So it really depends on what you're trying to convey, what you're attempting to combat.
Great point. A few more questions for you. Do you think the rise of social media has exacerbated anti-immigration rhetoric through television news? So I'm assuming that this question is more related to how television news uses anti-immigration rhetoric through social media.
Certainly. So social media has made things like instantaneous. So now people are trying to be the first with a story, right? So they're trying to break the news first, and that means that they're going to maybe jump on something that hasn't been fact checked yet, and so it allows them to use the narratives that they're trying to progress, and even so, it enhances post-truth rhetoric. So I think in many ways, the use of social media has become, it definitely has exacerbated a lot of those things, and has been more useful for them.
And it's one of those issues where you don't know if it's the chicken or the egg with social media. in the news. It just kind of is a cyclical thing that goes around, right?
Right. Yeah.
We got a few more questions here. We may not have time for all of them. We'll try to get through. Does framing theory absolve the audience of any responsibility of how they're contributing to anti-immigrant narrative?
Sorry, repeat that one more time.
Yeah, no worries. Does framing theory absolve the audience of any responsibility of how they're contributing to an anti-immigrant narrative?
Uh, no, I would say no. I think it's important that people understand what these framing narratives are attempting to do. Um, but it's important for the person to try and educate themselves and to ask questions about those narratives that are being presented, and search for different sources of media that may be able to corroborate or discount those narratives that are being presented. So as there was some talked about yesterday, we have these echo chambers that we get put into, and the more that we search on the more that we search for things on social media or websites, those things get collected and they enhance that echo chamber. We start seeing more and more of those things. So it's up to us to break out of those echo chambers. And often we don't even realize we're necessarily in those echo chambers. But I think it's important that we as individuals take responsibility, um, and also to be patient and have conversations and dialogues with people. So I see often like people on Facebook will cut somebody out who is posting things that they disagree with. They may unfriend them, and I think that does a disservice to us as well. But I think it's not going to help that these narratives change.
Right.
So.
So next question for you says, your slides on framing theory are very interesting. Would you say that framing theory relates to the term fake news?
Yeah. So, fake news is a part of that rhetoric of post-truth, and framing theory really kind of enhances post-truth rhetoric in a sense. So it allows people to use narratives without, and that may not have all of the facts, but it allows them to use those narratives without being considered dishonest. So yeah, I certainly think that fake news and framing theory are interconnected for sure.
Right. Last question for you. It says here, I'm a teacher in Florida, and I see this kind of framing often in my community. What type of education on these framing tactics do you think could be useful to communities heavily influenced by Fox and similar organizations? What age should people start to learn about this?
Well, yeah, I think the younger the better in a sense. We uh, we are influenced by all of the things around us. There are a lot of noises around us, and whether that's the news, whether that's our parents, whether that's teachers. Um, so I think we have a lot of those things that are going on through our head, and it's hard to sort which is good information, which is bad information. So the sooner that we get those, like some teaching on how to understand and how to sort those things out, the better. So I think at a young age is a good idea. And as far as ways of teaching that, it's teaching people. I think what a lot of teachers do well is teaching people how to think for themselves and how to ask those important questions. The questions a lot of times are more important than the answers, right? I think the ability to ask good questions is really important. I think teachers do a really good job of that, and so I think continuing to do that, and especially at young ages, teaching people how to not accept the first thing that they see is good.
Well, great insight and great presentation today, Matthew. I'm so sorry. I'm using different names. Long day. David, thank you so much for this great presentation and all of the great imagery we were commenting earlier behind the scenes about all of the pictures that you used. So thank you for sharing all of that. And it looks like we might have another couple questions for you that I didn't get to, but for time's sake, we will have to have you go to the Q&A box to look at that. And we are going to start a 15-minute long break until our keynote speech from Professor Pondian. So here we'll begin that break until 5 p.m. London time, and we'll go from there. Thank you again.